Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick Gumowitz, the Engelson Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Joan Gans Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Sally Menard and Norton Garfinkel, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Hefner, your host on The Open Mind. Our guest today, Smithsonian historian John Grinspan, explores a subject dear to my heart as an ongoing chronicler of the youth vote on the American political scene. Grinspan is not speaking of Gen Z, the millennial generation, or baby boomers. Rather, his inaugural book, The Virgin Vote, considers how young Americans made democracy popular in the 19th century. Politicians knew how difficult it was to change the mind of a regular party man, Grinspan writes. So instead, they focused on harvesting the large crop of new voters, turning 21 every year. First-time voters paid special heed to the campaign before their initial national election. Win their virgin vote, and they would support your party for decades. Grinspan's history of young voters from the antebellum to post-war United States is the first of its kind. Impeccably sourced, insightful, and wholly relevant to today's political discourse. It's my pleasure to welcome John today to discuss the virgin vote then and now.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't you tell us about the origin of this book?
I wanted to challenge the cliche that young people just don't vote. It's so easy to kind of act as if that's an inevitable law of democracy, that young people aren't interested in politics, and as they get older, they become more committed. And I wanted to look back and show that when American democracy was loudest and most popular and turnouts were the highest, young people were actually the fuel driving the whole system, as you mentioned, as virgin voters, but also as activists and campaigners on the ground. And that political world encompassed voting, but also social influence. So people who weren't allowed to vote, for instance, women, underage men, African Americans in many places, could still have a large political impact.
As we analyze it then and now, let's differentiate between the pool that was voting. You couldn't vote if you were a woman. You couldn't vote in most cases if you were anything other than white, but you didn't have to be a landowner.
No, that's the big change, is property requirements. Throughout most of history, class and property have some bearing on who decides how the government works. There are very few democracies, and most have large populations that cannot vote. In the early 19th century, voting laws removed property requirements in most states. And so young men who could never afford to vote before stream into the system. And often we look back and enumerate who couldn't vote back then. And it's important to keep that in mind. But it's also important to read history moving forward and see how many people were voting for the first time and how actively they were engaging.
So do you tie this change in law to the emerging relevance of this youthful cohort? And what was the political consequence, starting from the inception, the formation of this new demographic?
Very few people set out to say we want young people more involved in politics. This is a hierarchical society in which young people are still looked down upon, but there's almost a convenient alliance in which there are many young people who in many ways live uncertain, difficult lives in the 19th century and want something to gravitate towards. And then there are political campaigns that really need to bring in new blood. There's a society with very few independent voters, so winning over people at 21 or younger is the best way to get them involved. So there's kind of a symbiotic relationship between young people and campaigners that builds and increases over the century.
And qualitatively, how was their impact felt in terms of ideology, in terms of progress, in terms of governance?
It's a complicated question because most of these young people are engaging as individuals. There's very few movements to improve the status of young people in society collectively. It's not a mass movement for youth liberation or strengthening young people. Young people are using politics very personally. And so very often they're voting the way they want to vote, the way their family votes. They're very rarely trying to improve their status. So there are millions of young people streaming into the system, but they're acting as individuals as opposed to some kind of mass movement often.
What were those, we think of pocketbook issues as motivating voters today. We think of Don't Tread on Me, reproductive rights for women. We think of eminent domain now as an issue, Don't Tread on My Land.
Yeah.
What was the political character collectively of all these portraits when you synopsize it? What can you say about these personal decisions within families that were motivating these young people?
I think you just hit the nail on the head. It's deeply personal. There's a host of issues that matter in 19th century democracy in terms of money and banks and slavery and immigration. But very often when you really dig down into these young people's diaries and into their letters, this ideology is surface and they have deeper personal motivations. They're living in a very uncertain time. It's very hard to go from youth to adulthood in the 19th century. And they're using the political system to assert themselves, to meet mentors, to meet bosses, to court and flirt in public, to become active in their communities. So very often the issue itself doesn't matter as much as what the young person needs to get out of political involvement.
You write here, children of politically divided households often found themselves drawn into adults' disagreements, which is not really an anomaly. Frankly, it parallels the contemporary experience, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, oh yeah.
And then you continue, in the 1840s, young people's political interest looked more like a momentary burst of enthusiasm than the beginning of a 6-decade-long plateau. More first-time voters participated in 1840 than in any other election in U.S. history. Nearly 40% of voters were new that year. Wow, yeah. 40%.
Yes, wow.
So you have to draw some assumption about the collective will of the political establishment. And I'm thinking about this unconventional 2016 presidential campaign in which, in the Republican primaries, young people are flooding to vote for Donald Trump. What do you attribute that moment where nearly 40% of voters were new?
There are a number of political and social pressures. First of all, as we mentioned, property requirements are going down, so more and more young people can vote. At the same time, the political system, in ways similar to today, is increasingly heating up in partisan ways. That Andrew Jackson had been president in the 1830s, and there's a host of really hot political fights over money, over banks, over the place of Native Americans in the American continent. There's all these, politics is getting more public, more open to non-elites, and much more bare knuckle. So there are all these young people at the same time who have a great need for politics in their life. It's hard to be a young person in 19th century America. There's uncertainty and instability in terms of how to get a job, how to become an adult, how to move forward in your life. And so they need politics right as the political system is hot and needs them. And it takes off in 1840 with this log cabin and hard cider election. And it builds from there. It's sustained over 60 years, which there are two striking stories here. One is new voters turning out en masse, and that's new and unique, and we have to study that. And then it's the sustainability of this democratic culture that passes it down to young people, to 12-year-olds and 14-year-olds, consistently for 60 years. We often focus on turnout, and we don't think as much about how do you make a political system sustainable? How do you keep incorporating young people?
It sounded to me from reading this like Back to the Future a little bit because of the exploitation of the worker, the feeling of economic unease. You write here, while American democracy halted at gender and racial boundaries, it leapt over class divisions. The formation of this electoral bloc was dictating any new policy, or was it largely a demographic change simply in who was voting?
It's both. It's more the latter than the former, because young people are still the lowest ranks of political organizations. They're not nominating the actual candidates. They're not writing the platforms. What they're doing is they are providing the massive votes that win elections, and they're providing all the labor. That campaigning in 19th century America, a time before mass communications, is incredibly labor intensive. It means hanging out in saloons and talking people into changing their vote, or going to these massive midnight rallies and marching in the middle of the street with a torch. It means rioting. It means political violence often. It means hanging out at the polls and pressuring people to change their vote, intimidating people to change their vote. And young people are useful as this labor. So they're not necessarily deciding who the next candidate will be or what the next issue will be. They're operating in a different way as the foot soldiers of political campaigns.
They're volunteering, they're canvassing.
Yes.
They, as you describe, are the animals. They have the animalistic ferocity of politics that is infecting them and their peers and their families.
And at the same time, they need this. Not only are they useful to these campaigners because they're free labor, they need political activism. It's hard to get a job. It's hard to hold on to a job. It's hard to meet a spouse. People move around. The whole social world in 19th century America is being shaken. Young people have need and they have a lot of ambitions. And the political involvement is a reliable way to assert those ambitions.
Well, help us understand that word need. Because today there's an absence of that need, seemingly. And one might attribute it to the lack or demise of retail politics, but how did they need politics in a way we don't need politics today? Or the assumption is that politics is dysfunctional. We need to unburden ourselves from politics.
I would say that we have that same need today. We're not necessarily using it the same way, but there's a lot of communities in which political activism is a great way to get engaged more. That if you look, you might say that democracy is social, and people are engaged because their society leads them to be engaged or not be engaged. And there are many people, especially lower income people in American society, who would really benefit from having the community involvement of politics. Whether we've given them the opportunity, whether we've made it an option for them, is not the question, but I think it would benefit them a lot.
Another aspect of this transformation was the development of the city, the American metropolis. What did that mean then, and how do you view it through the prism of today, which is largely an urban society?
Well, density of populations into cities changes everything. On the one hand, it makes life much more challenging in many ways. As people urbanize in the 19th century, they're cut off from the communities they've come from rural American communities, or if they're immigrants from European communities mostly, they're shaken up and they're thrown into these mass kind of roiling populations where disease is more prevalent, where work is often less safe, and they need those communities. They need to reform a community. 19th century cities are shaken, unstable environments, and parties offer a great way to find some stability. That if you live in New York, if you live in the Fifth Ward, if you live somewhere in New York City in 19th century America, you don't have connections necessarily to the church that your ancestors belonged to or the religious movement. You don't have connections to the fraternal organizations or the cultural organizations, but they're political parades that come down Broadway and circle Union Square. You can join in those and kind of form affiliations. And one of the things about city life then and now is the struggle to form those affiliations. And political involvement is a great way on a social level, not just in terms of benefiting the democracy, of meeting people and getting engaged in one's community.
So why don't you continue the story for us? As the youth vote evolves, what happens?
Well, it really happens around 1900. We love to blame young people today, and it's easy to do, but the real crash is a century ago. And there's this period when voter turnout throughout most of the 19th century is very high, 70, 80% of voters in most national campaigns. And then in 1900, it craters. And within a generation, it's down to less than half of eligible voters go to the polls. What happens is new voters don't turn out. Those who were voting continue to vote. But the 21-year-old who wants to get involved in a previous era doesn't want to get involved. And the question is why? And there's kind of a convergence again. Young people need the political system less. There's this whole youth culture being created around 1900. You see it in movie going and going to the beach and music and automobiles eventually that create a youth culture that isn't focused around marching at midnight to support a presidential candidate. They don't want the political system as much. At the same time, political campaigners, they don't do as good a job reaching out to young people, and they lose track of what was motivating young people all along, which was that these young people wanted to get something out of politics. Not something money necessarily, but they wanted adulthood out of politics. And so campaigners become much more formalized. remove the mixed institutions that were driving 19th century politics. So youth and entertainment is over here, and politics is over here. And by separating those out, young people don't need politics anymore. It's not benefiting them in any way. So voter turnout craters among young people, and it's remained low for the last century. In fact, we often complain about millennials. It's gotten better recently. The distance between the rates at which young people vote and the rates at which older people vote were often worse with Generation Xers and baby boomers, and there's more of a convergence lately. So things are, in a way, getting better in terms of youth involvement.
Why did that happen at the dawn of the progressive era? It would seemingly reinforce the idea of participatory politics, reforming the system, some of the rhetoric we hear on the campaign trail today.
You'd think so, and it's a shame it didn't work that way. But
why didn't it work that way?
A lot of it comes down to class. That the progressive era is really an era in which urban upper middle class reformers try to make society more rational in many ways. And one of the problems, as they see it with politics back then, is it's very working class. Your average voter, your average campaigner, your average person marching in the street or hanging out in the saloon is not the type of person that these upper middle class reformers want guiding the democracy. They don't want these construction workers and dock workers driving the democracy. And so they contrive a number of ways of cutting off poor people and working class people from politics. And that really hurts the young. And at the same time, they talk a lot about how much they want young. They talk about Teddy Roosevelt, for instance, as a symbol of the young president. But he's not 18. He's in his 40s, and he's from one of the most elite families in New York. So they pay lip service to the idea of youth in politics, but they're cutting off the classes that were driving politics.
What are those specific technical barriers that you allude to?
They close down the saloons, which hurts when you close down the saloons on election day.
Well, I mean more in terms of segregating the population.
In 19th century campaigning, yes, you're working for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or the Whig Party, but really it's a grassroots political movement in that you get together people you know, you form an organization, you get some uniforms, and you go have a parade. As the parties grow in power and become taken over more and more by these kind of upper middle class reformers, they take hold of the operations of campaigning. And they say, for instance, we don't really need demonstrations. We can hand out educational literature instead. Or they form these elite political clubs that can stand in very well for this grassroots public campaigning. And they do things that really were earnest, well-intentioned reforms that improve the structure of democracy, but hurt turnout at the same time. Voting reforms. And when you voted in 19th century America, you would go to the polls and somebody would give you a ballot, and you'd try to cast that ballot. And you could be tricked into casting the wrong ballot or intimidated from voting. They introduced the secret ballot in the 1880s and 1890s, in which the government prints ballots and you vote with them. It makes it a much cleaner process. It makes it much easier to vote your conscience, but it removes the social atmosphere of an election, and it makes it kind of drier and more about duty. And it cuts off illiterate people, too. If you don't know how to read, I can give you a ticket and say, vote this ticket, and you vote for the party. If you go into a booth and there's a government document that's 3 pages long with lists, and it's a way of cutting off the illiterate from voting, even though it's well-intentioned.
I think that Teddy Roosevelt, I think of him as a champion of a progressive movement, but I also think of him as a personality.
Yes.
And someone who would have galvanized even some of the disenfranchised elements within the political establishment. You're saying there were barriers to that. And you write that young people, as they continued to grow into the American society, they quickly distanced themselves from the old popular political culture. And I want to fast forward a bit now that you have tried to explain the source of that great reckoning, why young people did not continue in spades to vote. So how do you look at this millennial cohort in its relationship to a candidate like Donald Trump?
Well, I think part of the problem with engaging youth today is we focus on the politics of personality too much. That our model for how young people get involved in politics, and as you listed a number of candidates who played on this model, is there's a charismatic figure, be it Teddy Roosevelt or Barack Obama or whoever. Young people get excited for that candidate. They turn out in droves to vote for that candidate. And then what happens? No matter who that candidate is, they're never going to be able to live up to the expectations put upon them. And as they fail to live up to those expectations, those young people who had so much staked on that candidate lose interest in the entire political system. They might vote in one election for that candidate. They might vote to re-elect that candidate, but they're not built into the political system in the same way they could be if we focus more on the voter and less on the candidate. 19th century democracy works so well at engaging young people because often they don't even know who's running. These guys, is Millard Fillmore the president? They don't really know about the identity of these people. They're not really focused on them. They're much more internally focused about what they're going to get out of politics, what engagement means for them. And I think that's a much more stronger long-term model for politics. I think the model of youth get all fired up for somebody is a very brittle model, that it breaks really easily and it doesn't build long-term sustainable involvement.
Young people still are the engine of political campaigns. They're canvassing, they're
Yes.
phone banking, they're licking the envelopes and sending the mailers out.
Yeah.
So what's different? It's still personal in that they are that engine.
They're not valued the same way, though, as...
How?
Well, the virgin vote back in the 19th century is this ritual. When those who are eligible to vote go and vote for the first time, this is a centerpiece of American democracy. This is celebrated. People dress up to go do it. And they're really the focus much more than who they're going to be voting for. It's much more internally focused. And politics is much more personal. I think about the expression, the personal is political. We've for several decades now talked about that. We've gotten very good at seeing the ways in which personal identity affects our politics. We don't really flip it that often and see how the political is personal and how political involvement at age 18 or 21 or whatever can really be a self-assertion for people and really be more important even than who their candidate is or what they care about as an issue. It can really mean something for them. And another part of the problem is that we only really tend to reach out to youth for the most part in an election year. And it's mostly campaigns doing it. So they have a very short-term need for these young people. We need to build these more sustainable engagements.
But the personal today tends to be uglier in terms of what these young people want. I mean, certainly you could take a whole bandwagon of these Trump volunteers and ask them questions that might get to the crux of their concerns more than make America great again. But what they want out of the political system seems to be a ban on Muslims. Seems to be a set of policies that are driven by hatred and self-preservation. Maybe more self-preservation than hatred. But that seems to, when they have a need, you talk about having a need. That seems to be that cohort's need.
And often throughout history, the causes that have been riling up young people and getting them engaged are not necessarily ones we would support today. That secession was widely supported by young Southerners. The KKK was supported by young Confederate veterans. Throughout nativism, the Know Nothing movement, anti-immigrant sentiment has actually been a frequent view of young people because they often see immigrants as a threat at a point when they're unstable in their own lives. So I'm not saying this is going to make democracy better in terms of the issues, and bigger engagement might bring to the surface issues that we would rather be suppressed. Often it comes down to, when you look back at our history, the question of engaged participation or clean politics. But as engaged participation increases, politics gets a little less clean. So there's a trade-off with everything, and these aren't necessarily going to bring forth the best issues. It's a question of bringing in more people.
In the few minutes we have remaining, let's turn to the more democratic, liberal agenda inside. Bernie Sanders, while he preaches this message of high voter turnout, specifically on college campuses, in the primaries and caucuses to date, there hasn't been an outpouring of support that matches President Obama's then run in 2008. His message seems to be at odds with the reality on the ground right now.
Well, these are primaries and caucuses. It's still early. I don't actually know the numbers for Obama's primaries and early caucuses. It's too early for me to say either way.
To the extent that people have described Sanders and Trump channeling this same populist blue-collar frustration, is there any historical parallel as we finish here, John, that informs how you look at these candidacies? Any campaigners of the 19th century or ideologues of the 19th century who you kind of get your inspiration from when you think about how we should understand what's happening today? And really, are the tectonic plates being shifted, or is this just kind of the musical chairs of American politics, or pendulum swinging back and forth?
The one thing I can say, rather than pointing to particular people, is that when it comes to engaging young people, historically it only really works when you think long term. When you focus on the next campaign or the next 6 months, usually you build very brittle, very fragile politics, if you engage young people at all, that don't last very long. What society was really good at in the 19th century was engaging children at age 10 and youths and adolescents at age 12 or 14 or whatever, and building a really layered political engagement that's really strong and lasts for a long time. If we just focus on a campaign or a primary state, we're really building the kind of politics where people burn out and lose interest very easily.
Well, that's really important, John, because you just finally you point out that the nature of interfamily relations was different. There was a constant engagement from ma to pa and pa to children. That fostered a kind of political education that is absent today, with daycare and with nannies and with impoverished people living in homeless shelters and not being able to read the news.
Yeah. The number one thing that gets young people voting back then, and statistically it's been found today, is social engagement by the people around them. And we, adults and older people, who sit on the sidelines and say young people just don't vote, and don't talk to their children or their grandchildren about politics, and don't engage them and make it something that they're going to do, are really letting those young people down. That we train people in society to be employees or parents or spouses. We spend very little time training people to be voters and citizens. And that's really what built such engagement in the 19th century. And I think if we really want young people voting in larger numbers today, all of society, not just young people, needs to think more about how we talk about politics, when we talk about politics, and how we engage 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds in the political process, not just say, go at age 18.
John, thanks for coming here to talk about the virgin vote with us today.
Oh, thank you.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick Gumowitz, the Engelson Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Joan Gans Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Sally Menard and Norton Garfinkel, with special thanks to the Schumann Media Center for additional support, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.